The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when retired Master Sergeant Frank Holloway finally decided to take his dog into the woods behind his property in Fayetteville, North Carolina. At 67 years old, with 30 years of Army service behind him and a Purple Heart collecting dust in a drawer, Frank preferred the quiet company of trees and his German Shepherd, Ranger. To the noise of the modern world, Ranger bounded ahead through the pine forest, his tags jingling against his collar. Frank followed at a slower pace, his left leg stiff from the shrapnel wound he'd taken in Fallujah back in 2004. The doctors had wanted to amputate below the knee, but Frank had refused. He'd walked into that city on 2 legs, and he'd be damned if he came home with less than he'd started with. The forest floor was soft with fallen needles, and morning mist clung to the low branches. Frank had walked these woods 1,000 times since moving here after his retirement, but today, Ranger was acting strange. The dog kept circling back to a massive oak tree about 100 yards from the property line, whining and pawing at the trunk. "What have you found, boy?" Frank called, making his way over. Ranger sat at attention, his nose pressed against a strange bulge in the tree trunk about chest height. Frank ran his hand over it. The bark was distorted, grown around something that had been embedded there for years, maybe decades. The wood had swelled and twisted, creating a sealed compartment that nature had tried to hide. Frank pulled his folding knife from his pocket. He'd carried a knife every day since basic training at Fort Benning in 1976, and old habits died hard. He worked the blade into the seam where the bark met the bulge, prying carefully. The wood was soft from the rain, and after a few minutes of patient work, a section came loose. Inside the hollow was a military-issue canvas bag, sealed in plastic and covered in decades of tree sap. Frank's hands trembled as he pulled it free. The bag was olive drab, standard issue from the 70s or 80s, and it was heavy, maybe 5 pounds. Through the plastic, he could see the outline of what looked like documents and something metal. Ranger whined softly. Sensing his master's tension, Frank carried the bag back to his cabin, his mind racing. Someone had hidden this deliberately, had climbed this tree and sealed it inside, trusting the oak to keep it secret. But why? And how long ago? Inside the cabin, Frank laid the bag on his kitchen table and carefully cut away the plastic. The canvas underneath was remarkably well preserved, protected from the elements by both the plastic and the tree itself. He unbuckled the straps with fingers that remembered 1,000 similar buckles from 1,000 similar bags, and opened it. The first thing he saw was a photograph. Faded but clear. 5 soldiers in Vietnam-era jungle fatigues, standing in front of a Huey helicopter. They were young, impossibly young, and covered in mud. On the back, someone had written in pencil, "Firebase Alpha, March 1971. Operation Phoenix. We did what we had to do." Frank's breath caught. Operation Phoenix. He knew that name, knew what it meant. It had been one of the CIA's most controversial programs during Vietnam, designed to identify and neutralize Viet Cong infrastructure. But officially, the military's direct involvement had always been denied. Beneath the photograph were documents, mission reports, classified communications, and a handwritten journal that filled 3 small notebooks. Frank opened the first page and read, "My name is Specialist Robert Hayes, and this is my confession. What we did in Vietnam under Operation Phoenix was murder disguised as duty, and I can't carry this silence anymore. If something happens to me, someone needs to know the truth." Frank sat down heavily, his leg throbbing. Hayes. That name was familiar. He pulled out his phone and searched the name along with Vietnam and Phoenix. The results made his stomach turn. Robert Hayes had been found dead in 1972, less than a year after returning from Vietnam. The official cause of death was listed as a hunting accident near Fort Bragg, now Fort Liberty, just 15 miles from where Frank was sitting. Hayes had been 23 years old, but according to the journal in Frank's hands, it hadn't been an accident. Hayes had been murdered because he'd threatened to expose what his unit had done under Operation Phoenix. And the man who'd ordered his death was someone who'd gone on to become a highly decorated officer. Someone whose name Frank recognized because it was carved on a memorial plaque at Fort Liberty's Special Operations Command. Building, Colonel Richard Hartman. Retired with full honors in 1995. Awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Bronze Stars, and the Legion of Merit. A man celebrated as a hero of the Special Forces community. A man who, according to Hayes' journal, had personally executed civilian prisoners and ordered his men to do the same, then covered it up by claiming they were enemy combatants. Frank looked at Ranger, who had curled up by the fireplace. "What do I do with this boy?" The dog's tail thumped once against the floor. Frank knew what his younger self would have done: marched straight to the authorities with the evidence and demanded justice. But he was older now, and he'd seen how the system protected its own. Hartman was connected, powerful even in retirement. The military didn't like dredging up the past, especially when that past involved operations that the public had never fully been told about. But then, Frank thought about Robert Hayes, 23 years old, killed for trying to do the right thing. He thought about all the other soldiers who'd carried secrets and shame, because they'd been told that some truths were better left buried. And he made his decision. This wasn't going to stay buried. Not on his watch. Some promises weren't spoken, but they were binding all the same. And Frank Holloway had spent 30 years defending a principle: that truth mattered, that justice mattered, and that no soldier living or dead should be abandoned to silence. He picked up his phone and started making calls. Part 2. The weight of the past. Frank's first call went to his old company commander from Iraq, Lieutenant Colonel James Bradford, who now worked as a civilian contractor for the Department of Defense. They'd served together during the Second Battle of Fallujah, and Bradford was one of the few men Frank trusted completely. "Frank Holloway." Bradford's voice came through warm and surprised. "Been too long, Master Sergeant. What's on your mind?" "I need advice, sir." "Off the record." There was a pause. "How far off the record?" "All the way off." Bradford's tone shifted, becoming careful. "Go ahead." Frank explained what he'd found: the bag, the journal, the photographs. He didn't mention Hartman's name yet, wanting Bradford's honest reaction without the weight of that particular legacy coloring his judgment. When Frank finished, Bradford was silent for a long moment. Then, "Frank, you're talking about opening a case that's been closed for over 50 years. Operation Phoenix is still classified in some respects. The people involved, the ones still alive, have powerful friends. If even half of what's in that journal is true, you're not just challenging one man. You're challenging an entire network that spent decades protecting a narrative. I know that, sir. Do you? Because this isn't like reporting a safety violation or filing a complaint through normal channels. This is accusing decorated veterans of war crimes. The blowback could destroy you." Frank looked at the photograph of Hayes and his unit. "A kid died trying to tell the truth, Colonel. He was 23. He came home from war and someone killed him to keep him quiet. That doesn't sit right with me." Bradford exhaled slowly. "No, it doesn't sit right with me either. But you need to be smart about this. If you go to the military first, they'll bury it under classified exemptions and national security concerns. You need someone outside the chain of command, someone who can't be pressured to make this disappear." "Who?" "There's an investigative journalist I know, works for the Washington Tribune. Her name is Jennifer Walsh. She specializes in military accountability stories. She broke the story about the contractor fraud at Bagram in 2015. She's relentless, and she doesn't scare easy. If you give her this, she'll run with it." Frank hesitated. Going to the press felt like a betrayal of the uniform somehow, like airing dirty laundry in public. But Bradford was right. The military wouldn't investigate this honestly. Not when it involved someone like Hartman. "Give me her contact information," Frank said after he hung up. Frank spent the next hour reading through Hayes's journal more carefully. The entries were methodical, almost clinical. As Hayes documented missions that had started as legitimate operations, but had devolved into something darker. One entry from April 1971 stood out. "Colonel Hartman ordered us to interrogate 3 prisoners we captured near the Cambodian border. When they wouldn't talk, he told us to make an example. I thought he meant roughing them up, scaring them. But he pulled out his sidearm and shot the first man in the head. Then he handed the gun to Sergeant Davis and told him to do the second one. Davis refused. Hartman put him on report and did it himself. The 3rd prisoner talked, but Hartman killed him anyway. He said leaving witnesses was operationally unsound. We buried the bodies in the jungle and reported them as enemy Kia. I can't sleep anymore." Frank's hand shook as he read. He'd seen combat, had made hard calls under fire, but this wasn't combat. This was execution. This was murder. He picked up his phone and called the number Bradford had given him. Jennifer Walsh answered on the second ring. "Walsh. Ms. Walsh, my name is Frank Holloway. I'm a retired Army Master Sergeant, and I have information about war crimes committed during Vietnam under Operation Phoenix. James Bradford said you might be interested." There was a sharp intake of breath. "Bradford sent you to me?" "Yes, ma'am. What kind of information are we talking about?" "Documents, photographs, a first-hand journal written by a soldier who witnessed the crimes and was killed to keep him quiet. Evidence that implicates a high-ranking officer who retired with full honors." Walsh's voice became laser-focused. "Where are you located, Master Sergeant?" "Fayetteville, North Carolina. I can be there tomorrow morning." "Don't talk to anyone else about this. Don't make copies. Don't put anything online. Just sit tight until I get there." "Yes, ma'am." After he hung up, Frank felt the weight of what he'd set in motion. Once Walsh published this story, there would be no taking it back. Hartman's reputation would be destroyed. The Special Forces community would be rocked by scandal. And Frank himself would become a target for everyone who wanted the past to stay buried. That night, he barely slept. He kept thinking about Hayes, about the fear that young soldier must have felt when he realized his own command wanted him dead. Hayes had tried to do the right thing, and it had cost him everything. Frank had been given a second chance to finish what Hayes had started. And he wasn't going to waste it. At 0600 hours, Ranger woke him with a low growl. Frank sat up, instantly alert despite the sleepless night. The dog was staring at the window, his hackles raised. Frank moved to the window and looked out. A dark sedan was parked at the end of his driveway, barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness. Someone was sitting inside, watching the cabin. Frank's military training kicked in. He grabbed his phone and took a photo of the car, zooming in on the license plate. Then he texted it to Bradford with a simple message. "Someone's watching my house." Bradford's reply came within seconds. "Stay inside. I'm calling local PD." But Frank knew local police wouldn't be enough. Whoever was in that car wasn't there by accident. Someone already knew what he'd found, and they were making sure he understood the stakes. Part 3. Eyes in the Dark. Sedan remained at the end of Frank's driveway until the Fayetteville Police Department arrived 20 minutes later. By then, whoever had been watching had disappeared into the morning mist, leaving only tire tracks in the soft dirt shoulder. Officer Maria Santos, a compact woman in her early 30s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, took Frank's statement on his front porch while Ranger sat protectively at his feet. "You're sure you don't know anyone who might have reason to surveil your property, Master Sergeant?" she asked, Her pen poised over her notepad. Frank hesitated. He couldn't tell her the whole truth, not yet, but he couldn't lie to law enforcement either. I recently came across some old military documents. It's possible someone doesn't want them made public. Santos's expression sharpened. What kind of documents? The kind that involve powerful people. That's all I can say right now. She studied him for a long moment, then closed her notepad. I've been a cop for 9 years, and I've lived in Fayetteville my whole life. This town is built on Fort Liberty, and I've seen what happens when people ask uncomfortable questions about things that happened decades ago. They get visits like the one you had this morning. Sometimes the visits get worse. I appreciate the warning, officer. It's not just a warning, Master Sergeant. It's advice. Whatever you found, whatever you're planning to do with it, be careful. The people who have the most to lose are usually the ones with the most resources to protect themselves. After Santos left, Frank called Bradford again. The police came and went, Frank reported. Whoever was watching is gone. For now, Bradford said grimly. Frank, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Have you told anyone besides me and Walsh about this? No one. Then we have a problem. The only way someone could know you found those documents this fast is if they were already watching you, or if they have surveillance on something connected to Hayes or Hartman. Either way, you're on someone's radar now. Frank felt a chill run down his spine. What are you saying? I'm saying that whoever killed Hayes didn't work alone, and they didn't disappear after he died. There's an infrastructure that's been protecting this secret for 50 years. You just rang their alarm bell. Walsh is coming tomorrow. Good. When she gets there, give her everything and go somewhere else for a few days. Stay with your daughter in Virginia. Stay at a hotel. I don't care. Just don't stay in that cabin alone. Frank bristled. I'm not running from some ghosts from the past. It's not about running, Frank. It's about staying alive long enough to make sure the truth comes out. Hayes didn't run, and he ended up dead. Don't make his mistake. The line went dead. Frank stood on his porch, looking out at the forest where he'd found the tree hollow. Ranger leaned against his leg, a warm presence in the morning cold. Bradford's right, isn't he, boy? Frank said quietly. I'm in over my head. But even as he said it, he knew he wasn't going to back down. He'd spent 30 years in the Army, had faced enemy fire and IEDs, and the kind of chaos that broke lesser men. He wasn't about to be intimidated by shadows and threats. The rest of the day passed slowly. Frank made copies of the most important documents, Hayes's journal entries, the photograph, the mission reports, and sealed them in a waterproof bag that he buried under a false floorboard in his shed. If something happened to the originals, there would still be proof. At 1400 hours, his phone rang. The number was unlisted. Frank answered cautiously. Hello? Master Sergeant Holloway. The voice was male, cultured, with the kind of authority that came from decades of giving orders. My name is David Brenner. I'm calling on behalf of certain interested parties who are concerned about some materials that may have come into your possession. Frank's grip tightened on the phone. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you do. You found a bag in a tree on your property. Inside that bag were documents related to classified military operations from the Vietnam era. Those documents are the property of the United States government, and their unauthorized possession constitutes a violation of federal law. If they're government property, then the government can file a formal request for their return through appropriate legal channels. There was a pause, then a soft chuckle. You're a decorated veteran, Master Sergeant. A man who understands honor and the importance of protecting the institution you served. The materials you found could cause significant damage to the reputation of honorable men who served their country in difficult times. Surely you can understand why it would be better for everyone if those materials were simply returned and forgotten. Robert Hayes was an honorable man, Frank said, his voice hardening. And he was murdered for trying to tell the truth. I'm not going to help cover that up. The warmth in Brenner's voice evaporated. You're making a mistake, Master Sergeant. The people involved in this matter have resources and connections you can't imagine. They will protect their interests, and they will not allow one stubborn old man to undo decades of careful management. If you persist, you will be destroyed, financially, legally, and personally. Your military pension can be reviewed. Your service record can be audited. Your family can be investigated. Do you really want to bring that kind of attention on yourself and the people you love? Frank's jaw clenched. Are you threatening me? I'm offering you a choice. Return the materials, sign a non-disclosure agreement, and receive a significant financial settlement for your cooperation. Or refuse and face the consequences of challenging forces much larger than yourself. I've faced larger forces before, Frank said. They didn't scare me then, and you don't scare me now. Then you're a fool. You have until tomorrow morning to reconsider. After that, the offer is withdrawn and other measures will be taken. The line went dead. Frank set down the phone, his hands shaking, not from fear, but from anger. They'd threatened his family. They'd threatened his pension, his livelihood, everything he'd earned through 3 decades of service. But they'd also confirmed everything Hayes had written in his journal. If the documents were worthless, if Hayes had been lying, they wouldn't be offering settlements and making threats. They were scared, and scared people made mistakes. Frank called his daughter Emily, who lived in Richmond. Dad? She sounded surprised. He didn't call often. Everything okay? I need you to listen carefully. I'm involved in something that might get complicated. I don't want you to worry, but I also don't want you to be surprised if some people start asking questions about me or our family. What kind of people? The kind who don't like it when old secrets ghost. I found some documents that prove war crimes were committed in Vietnam and covered up for 50 years. I'm going to make sure the truth comes out, but the people responsible are going to try to stop me. There was a long silence. Then Emily said, "Is this dangerous?" "It might be." "Then don't do it, Dad, please. You've served your country long enough. Let someone else fight this battle." Frank looked at the photograph of Hayes and his unit, still sitting on his kitchen table. "I can't, sweetheart. A soldier died trying to expose this, and his death was covered up just like the crimes he witnessed. If I walk away now, I'm no better than the people who killed him." Emily's voice cracked. "I can't lose you, Dad. You won't. But I need you to be prepared, just in case. If anything happens to me, there's a bag buried under the floorboard in my shed. Inside are copies of documents that need to go to a journalist named Jennifer Walsh at the Washington Tribune. Can you remember that? Jennifer Walsh, Washington Tribune. Good girl. I love you, I love you too, Dad. Please be careful." After he hung up, Frank sat in the gathering darkness and thought about the choice he'd made. He could still back out, still take Brenner's offer, and live out his retirement in peace. No one would blame him. He'd done his duty. But duty wasn't just about following orders or serving your time. It was about standing up when standing up was hard. It was about refusing to let injustice hide behind rank and medals and institutional protection. Hayes had understood that. And now, 50 years too late, Frank was going to make sure Hayes's courage hadn't been wasted. Tomorrow, Jennifer Walsh would arrive. Tomorrow, the truth would start to come out, and Frank Holloway would finally pay the debt that Robert Hayes had died trying to collect. Part 4. The journalist arrives. Jennifer Walsh pulled into Frank's driveway at 0800 hours in a rented sedan. Her arrival exactly on time. She was younger than Frank had expected, maybe 40, with dark hair, pulled into a tight ponytail and eyes that missed. Nothing as they scanned the property before she got out of the car. Frank met her on the porch, Ranger at his side. Walsh extended her hand with a firm grip that spoke of confidence and determination. "Master Sergeant Holloway, thank you for trusting me with this. Come inside, ma'am. We have a lot to discuss." Over coffee at Frank's kitchen table, he laid out everything. The discovery in the tree, Hayes' journal, the photograph, the mission reports. Walsh listened without interrupting, taking rapid notes in a shorthand Frank couldn't decipher. When he finished, she sat back and studied the documents with the intensity of someone who knew exactly how explosive they were. "This is going to destroy Hartman's legacy," she said finally. "And it's going to raise serious questions about how many other Operation Phoenix crimes were covered up. The Defense Department is going to fight this with everything they have. I know. They'll claim the documents are forgeries. They'll say Hayes was unstable, that his journal is unreliable. They'll attack your credibility and mine. They'll tie this up in court for years if they can. I know that too." Walsh met his eyes. "Then why are you doing this? You've got nothing to gain and everything to lose." Frank thought about how to answer. He could talk about duty or honor or justice, but those words felt inadequate. Finally, he said, "Because I'm 67 years old, and if I don't do this now, I'll die knowing I had the chance to make something right and I didn't take it. That's not the kind of man I want to be." Walsh nodded slowly. "Okay, here's how this works. I'm going to take these documents back to my office. My team will authenticate them, handwriting analysis, paper dating, cross-referencing with military records. We'll interview anyone from Hayes' unit who's still alive. We'll build a case so airtight that the Defense Department can't dismiss it. But it's going to take time. How much time? At least 6 weeks. Maybe longer. Can you hold out that long?" Frank thought about the sedan watching his house, about Brenner's threats. "I can hold out." "Good, because once this story breaks, you're going to be at the center of a firestorm. The press will camp on your lawn. Veterans groups will either hail you as a hero or condemn you as a traitor. Your life is going to change permanently. Are you ready for that?" "No," Frank admitted. "But I'm doing it anyway." Walsh smiled, a quick, fierce expression that reminded Frank of the young officers he'd served with in Iraq. "Then let's make sure we do it right." She spent the next hour photographing every page of Hayes' journal, every document, every detail. She asked Frank to walk her through exactly where and how he'd found the bag, and she took her own photos of the tree hollow. When she was satisfied, she packed everything carefully into a reinforced briefcase. "I'll be in touch every few days," she said. "Don't talk to anyone else about this. Don't post anything online. Don't even tell your friends. The fewer people who know before publication, the harder it will be for someone to kill the story." After she left, Frank felt both relieved and more anxious than before. The evidence was out of his hands now, in the care of someone who knew how to use it. But that also meant he'd lost control of the narrative. Whatever happened next, he'd have to trust Walsh to get it right. The rest of the day passed quietly. Too quietly. Frank found himself checking the windows constantly, looking for the sedan or any other sign of surveillance. Ranger seemed to sense his tension and stayed close, his head resting on Frank's knee whenever Frank sat down. At 1900 hours, Frank's phone rang again. This time the caller ID showed a local number. "Hello? Master Sergeant Holloway, this is Colonel Marcus Webb, retired. I served with Richard Hartman in Vietnam. I understand you've come into possession of some materials that mention his name." Frank's guard went up immediately. "Who told you that?" "That's not important. What is important is that you understand the context of what happened in Vietnam. Operation Phoenix was a complicated program operating in an impossible situation. Good men did hard things because the mission required it. Judging them 50 years later by standards that didn't exist then is unfair and destructive. Murder is murder, Colonel. The standards against it existed in 1971, just like they do now. Webb's voice hardened. You weren't there, Master Sergeant. You don't know what it was like. You don't know the pressure we were under or the impossible choices we had to make. Hartman is a hero who served his country for 30 years. If you destroy his reputation based on the confused writings of one unstable soldier, Robert Hayes wasn't unstable. Frank interrupted. He was 23 years old, and he was killed because he refused to be part of a cover-up. And I'm not going to help you continue that cover-up. Then you're condemning innocent men. Innocent men don't murder prisoners and bury them in the jungle. There was a long silence. Then Webb said, very quietly, You're making powerful enemies, Master Sergeant. Enemies who will do whatever it takes to protect their brothers in arms. I'm calling as a courtesy, one veteran to another, to give you a chance to reconsider. But if you don't, then what? Frank challenged. You'll send another car to watch my house? You'll threaten my family? You'll try to destroy my pension? I've already heard all the threats, Colonel. They don't scare me. Perhaps they should, Webb said, and hung up. Frank set down the phone, his heart racing. 2 calls in 2 days, both escalating in their tone. They were getting desperate, which meant Walsh was right. The documents were real, and the people implicated knew it. That night, Frank couldn't sleep. He lay in bed listening to every sound outside his cabin. Ranger curled at the foot of the bed like a furry sentinel. At 0200 hours, he heard the crunch of gravel in his driveway. Frank grabbed the baseball bat he kept beside his bed and moved to the window. A pickup truck had pulled up to his cabin, headlights off. 2 figures got out, both wearing dark clothing and moving with military precision. Frank's combat instincts kicked in. He grabbed his phone and dialed 911 while moving to a position where he could see both the front and back doors. Ranger was on his feet now, growling low in his throat. 911, what's your emergency? 2 armed intruders approaching my residence, Frank said quietly, giving his address. I'm a retired master sergeant, and I believe this is connected to a threat I reported yesterday. Officers are on the way, sir. Stay on the line. Through the window, Frank watched the 2 figures approach his front door. One of them was carrying something, a crowbar or a pry bar. They weren't trying to be subtle anymore. Frank made a decision. He opened the front door and stepped onto the porch, the bat in his hands, Ranger at his side barking furiously. This is private property, Frank called out. The police are on their way. I suggest you leave while you still can. The 2 figures froze. In the darkness, Frank couldn't make out their faces, but he could see their body language shift from confidence to uncertainty. They hadn't expected him to confront them directly. One of them took a step forward. We just want to talk, Master Sergeant. At 0200 hours with a crowbar? I don't think so. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. The 2 figures looked at each other, then ran back to their truck and sped off, tires kicking up gravel. Officer Santos arrived 5 minutes later with 2 other patrol cars. She listened to Frank's account with a grim expression. This is the 2nd incident in 2 days, Master Sergeant. Whatever you're involved in, it's escalating. I strongly recommend you consider protective custody or at least temporary relocation. I appreciate that, officer, but I'm staying put. Santos shook her head. You're a stubborn man. Yes, ma'am. I am. After the police left, Frank sat on his porch in the pre-dawn darkness. Ranger pressed against his legs. The message was clear. They were trying to intimidate him into silence. And if intimidation didn't work, they might try something worse. But Frank Holloway had survived Fallujah. He'd survived IEDs and ambushes and the kind of chaos that broke lesser men. He wasn't going to be broken by threats in the night. Hayes had stood alone against this conspiracy 50 years ago. and it had cost him his life. Frank wasn't alone. He had Walsh. He had Bradford. And he had the truth. That would have to be enough. Part 5. The walls closed and Jennifer Walsh called Frank 3 days after their meeting, her voice tight with controlled excitement. "We've authenticated the documents," she said. "The paper dates to the early 70s. The handwriting matches samples we obtained from Hayes's service records. And the photograph is genuine and hasn't been digitally altered. We also cross-referenced the mission reports with declassified CIA documents about Operation Phoenix, and everything lines up. This is real, Frank. How soon can you publish?" 2 weeks, maybe 3. We're still trying to track down survivors from Hayes's unit. We've located 2. James Davis, who lives in Oregon, and Thomas Chun, who's in a VA hospital in Texas. Both serve directly under Hartman. If we can get them to corroborate Hayes's account. Wait, Frank interrupted. You said Chun? Thomas Chun. He was a sergeant in the same unit. Why? Frank felt ice in his stomach. I told you to use only American military names. Chun is Chinese American, Walsh said firmly. Born in California. Enlisted in 1969. He's as American as you or me, and his service record is spotless. Don't let outdated thinking cloud your judgment, Master Sergeant. Frank closed his eyes, embarrassed. You're right. I apologize. Apology accepted. The point is, if Chun or Davis will talk, we'll have living witnesses to support Hayes's journal. But that's a big if. They've kept quiet for 50 years. Convincing them to speak now won't be easy. Do what you can, Frank said. Just be careful. The people protecting this secret are getting desperate. I noticed. My editor got a call yesterday from someone claiming to be from the Defense Department's legal office. They said we were in possession of classified materials and demanded we return them immediately. When my editor asked for official written documentation of the request, they hung up. They're trying to scare you. It's not working, Walsh said with grim satisfaction. But it confirms we're on the right track. People don't threaten lawsuits unless they're afraid of what we might publish. After they hung up, Frank tried to return to some semblance of normal life. He took Ranger on walks through the forest, maintained his cabin, and kept to his routines. But the tension was constant now, a weight that pressed down on him every waking moment. On the 4th day after Walsh's departure, Frank received a certified letter from a law firm in Washington. The letterhead was expensive, the kind that radiated money and power. The content was even more intimidating. Dear Master Sergeant Holloway, we represent a consortium of veterans and their families who are concerned about malicious and unfounded accusations being made against decorated service members. It has come to our attention that you are in possession of materials alleging criminal conduct during the Vietnam War, specifically related to Operation Phoenix. Our clients demand that you immediately cease and desist from any distribution or publication of these materials. The allegations contained therein are demonstrably false and constitute defamation against honorable men who served their country with distinction. Should you proceed with publication, our clients will pursue all available legal remedies, including but not limited to civil suits for defamation, invasion of privacy, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Furthermore, we are prepared to seek criminal charges related to your unlawful possession of classified government documents. Federal law provides severe penalties for the unauthorized retention of such materials, including imprisonment and substantial fines. You have 72 hours to confirm in writing that you will comply with this demand. Failure to do so will result in immediate legal action. Frank read the letter twice, then called Walsh. They're threatening to sue me for defamation and charge me with mishandling classified documents. Let them try, Walsh said. The documents aren't classified. If they were, they would have shown up in government databases when we did our authentication. And defamation requires proof of false statements made with malicious intent. We haven't published anything yet, and everything we will publish is factual and documented. So this is just more intimidation. Exactly. But Frank, I need you to understand something. Once we publish, these threats will become real lawsuits. They'll drag you through depositions and court appearances. They'll subpoena your records and your communications. They'll make your life hell for years. Are you still prepared for that? Frank thought about Hayes, about the young soldier who tried to do the right thing and paid with his life. Yes, he said. I'm prepared. Good, because I just got off the phone with Thomas Chun's daughter. She says her father wants to talk to me. He's dying stage 4 lung cancer, and he says he's ready to tell the truth before he runs out of time. Frank felt a surge of hope. That's huge. It is. I'm flying to Texas tomorrow to interview him. If he corroborates Hayes' account, we'll have everything we need. 2 days later, Walsh called again. This time, her voice was different, harder, colder. Chun confirmed everything, she said. He witnessed Hartman execute prisoners. He saw the bodies buried in the jungle. He was there when they falsified the after-action reports. And he told me something Hayes didn't know. Hartman didn't act alone. There were at least 5 other officers involved in the cover-up, including a major who went on to become a lieutenant general. How high does this go? All the way to the top of the Special Forces community during that era. We're not talking about one rogue colonel anymore. Frank, we're talking about institutional cover-up that protected war criminals for half a century. Frank sat down heavily. When are you publishing? Next Monday. We'll run the full story online at 0600 hours Eastern, with a print edition following the next day. I wanted to give you advance notice so you can prepare. Prepare for what? For your life to change completely, Walsh said bluntly. The moment that story goes live, every news organization in the country is going to want to interview you. Your phone will ring nonstop. Reporters will camp outside your cabin. And the people we're exposing will do everything in their power to destroy your credibility and paint you as a traitor to the veteran community. I can handle it. Can you? Because Chun's already getting death threats, and we haven't even published yet. Someone leaked that he was talking to us. His daughter has had to hire private security. Frank felt a chill. How did they find out? I don't know. But it means they have sources inside either my organization or the VA hospital. They're watching every move we make. After he hung up, Frank walked out onto his porch and looked at the forest where this had all begun. The oak tree stood silent in the distance, its secret finally exposed after 5 decades of silence. He thought about calling Emily, about warning her that things were about to get worse. But what could he say that wouldn't just frighten her more? Instead, he sat with Ranger and watched the sun set over the trees. In 4 days, the truth would be public. In 4 days, Robert Hayes would finally get the justice he died trying to achieve, and Frank Holloway would face whatever consequences came from keeping a promise to a dead soldier he'd never met. Some debts were worth paying, no matter the cost. Part 6. The Truth Breaks. The story broke at 0600 hours on Monday morning, exactly as Walsh had promised. Frank was already awake, sitting at his computer with Ranger at his feet. When the Washington Tribune's website updated, the headline stretched across the screen in bold letters. Buried Truth: How the Military Covered Up Vietnam War Crimes for 50 Years. Below it was the photograph of Hayes and his unit. Young faces staring out from a past that had finally caught up with the present. Frank read the article slowly, his coffee growing cold beside him. Walsh had done exceptional work. The story laid out Hayes' journal entries in chronological order, interspersed with Chun's first-hand testimony and corroborating evidence from declassified documents. She'd tracked down the families of two of the prisoners Hartman had executed, Vietnamese civilians who'd been living near the Cambodian border in 1971. She'd found the crash site where Hayes had died and interviewed the retired Air Force investigator who'd worked to the case, a man who admitted he'd been pressured to rule it an accident despite evidence of foul play. The article didn't just accuse Hartman. It named names. 5 other officers who'd participated in the executions or the cover-up, including retired Lieutenant General Marcus Webb, the same Webb who'd called Frank to threaten him. Within an hour, Frank's phone started ringing. The first call was from a morning news show producer asking for an interview. Then a reporter from a veterans newspaper. Then 3 different talk radio hosts. Frank declined them all, referring everyone to Walsh's article. At 0800 hours, Bradford called. "You've done it, Frank. The story's everywhere. CNN, Fox, MSNBC, they're all running with it." The Defense Department just issued a statement saying they're reviewing the allegations with appropriate seriousness. What does that mean? It means they're scrambling to figure out how to spin this. But they can't make it go away, not with Chen's testimony and all the documentation Walsh published. This is too big. What about Hartman? His family released a statement an hour ago denying everything. They're calling it a politically motivated smear campaign against a decorated veteran. But Frank, here's the thing, Hartman himself hasn't said anything. No interviews, no public appearances. My sources tell me his lawyers have advised complete silence. Good. Let him stay silent. Hayes didn't get that option. By midday, the media frenzy had reached Frank's property. News vans lined the road outside his cabin, and reporters with cameras stood at the edge of his driveway, waiting for a glimpse of the man who'd sparked the story. Frank stayed inside, curtains drawn, watching the circus through his windows. At 1400 hours, Walsh called. "How are you holding up?" "I've been under fire before," Frank said. "This is just a different kind of ammunition." "Well, brace yourself, because it's about to get worse." A veterans group called Guardians of Honor just held a press conference calling you a traitor and demanding criminal charges for unauthorized possession of classified materials. They're organizing a protest outside the Tribune's offices tomorrow. Are they connected to Hartman? 3 of their board members served under him in Vietnam. This is a coordinated pushback. Frank clenched his jaw. They can call me whatever they want. It doesn't change the facts. No, it doesn't. But Frank, there's something else. I got a call from the FBI this morning. They want to interview you about how you obtained the documents and whether you violated any federal laws. The documents were hidden in a tree on my property. I know, and I'd already given them a statement to that effect. But they're under pressure from the Defense Department to find something, anything, they can use to discredit you or shut down the story. You need to get a lawyer, Frank. A good one. I can't afford a lawyer. The Tribune has retained one for you. His name is Michael Torres, no relation to Robert, and he specializes in First Amendment cases. He'll be in touch today. After they hung up, Frank sat in silence, the weight of what he'd said in motion pressing down on him. This wasn't just about exposing one man's crimes anymore. It had become a battle over memory, accountability, and whether the military could be trusted to police itself. His phone buzzed with a text from Emily. "Dad, I'm seeing your name on the news. Are you okay?" He texted back, "I'm fine. Don't believe everything they say about me. I love you." At 1700 hours, Frank's doorbell rang. When he looked through the peephole, he saw a man in his 60s standing on the porch, wearing a Vietnam Veterans of America cap and a windbreaker. Frank didn't recognize him. He opened the door cautiously, Ranger growling at his side. "Can I help you?" The man extended his hand. "Master Sergeant Holloway, my name is William Parker. I served in Vietnam with Robert Hayes. I was his squad leader. I've been following the news, and I needed to come here and say something to you in person." Frank studied him warily, then shook his hand. "Come in." Parker sat at Frank's kitchen table, his hands trembling slightly as he accepted a cup of coffee. "I should have spoken up 50 years ago," he said quietly. "I knew what Hartman was doing. I knew Hayes was scared. And when he died, I knew it wasn't an accident. But I was 25 years old with a pregnant wife at home, and Hartman made it very clear what would happen if any of us talked." "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I'm 73 years old, and I've lived 50 years with this guilt. When I saw your name in the article, when I read what you sacrificed to bring this truth out, I realized I couldn't stay silent anymore. I'm calling Jennifer Walsh tomorrow to give her a formal statement. I'm going to testify to everything I saw." Frank felt his throat tighten. "That takes courage." "No," Parker said, shaking his head. "What you did takes courage. What Hayes did takes courage. I'm just an old man trying to make peace with his conscience before I die." After Parker left, Frank stood on his porch and watched the sun set behind the media vans. More witnesses were coming forward. The truth was spreading beyond what Walsh had published, becoming a movement of its own. Hayes had been alone when he tried to expose Hartman. But Frank wasn't alone. And neither was the truth anymore. Part 7. The Reckoning. 3 weeks after the story broke, Frank sat in a conference room at the Department of Justice headquarters in Washington, flanked by his attorney Michael Torres and Jennifer Walsh. Across the table sat 2 FBI agents, a Defense Department lawyer, and a representative from the Army Criminal Investigation Command. The lead FBI agent, a stern woman named Sarah Mitchell, opened a folder and pulled out a photograph, the same photograph Frank had found in the tree hollow. "Master Sergeant Holloway, we've completed our investigation into the materials you discovered. I'm here to inform you that no charges will be filed against you for possession of the documents. They were found on your private property and do not meet the threshold for classified materials under federal law." Frank felt his shoulders relax for the first time in weeks. Mitchell continued, "However, our investigation has uncovered substantial evidence supporting the allegations made in the Washington Tribune article. We are opening a formal war crimes investigation into the actions of Colonel Richard Hartman and the other officers named in Robert Hayes' journal. Due to the age of the crimes and the jurisdictional complexities involved, prosecution may not be possible. But we are committed to establishing the facts and ensuring a complete public record." The Defense Department lawyer, a pinched-faced man named Stevens, leaned forward. "Agent Mitchell, I must remind you that many of the individuals named in this investigation are deceased or elderly. Pursuing charges against veterans who served in combat is a delicate matter that requires justice." Mitchell interrupted coldly. "It requires justice. And the Justice Department does not recognize a statute of limitations on murder." Stevens's face reddened, but he said nothing. Walsh spoke up. "What about Robert Hayes' death? Will that be investigated?" Mitchell nodded. "We're reopening the case. The original investigation was conducted by local law enforcement with minimal military involvement, which was standard for off-base incidents at the time. But given the evidence of foul play and the clear motive for murder, we believe a new investigation is warranted." "Do you have suspects?" Frank asked. "We're pursuing several leads," Mitchell said carefully. "But I can tell you that we've identified at least 3 individuals who were in the area at the time of Hayes' death and who had connections to Hartman's operation. 2 are deceased. The 3rd is being interviewed as we speak." After the meeting, Frank, Torres, and Walsh walked out of the building into a cold Washington afternoon. News cameras were waiting on the steps, and reporters shouted questions as they descended. Frank stopped at the microphone stand that had been set up for the press conference the FBI had scheduled. "I'll make a brief statement," he said. The cameras focused on him, and Frank took a breath before speaking. 50 years ago, Staff Sergeant Robert Hayes tried to expose war crimes committed by his commanding officer. He was murdered for it, and his death was covered up as an accident. For half a century, the men responsible for his murder lived free. Some of them celebrated as heroes. That injustice ends today. He pulled out the photograph of Hayes and held it up to the cameras. This young man believed that the uniform meant something. He believed that honor and accountability mattered more than loyalty to corrupt officers. He paid for that belief with his life. But his courage wasn't wasted. The truth he tried to tell is finally being heard, and the men who silenced him are finally being held to account. Frank lowered the photograph. "I'm not a hero. I'm just an old soldier who found some documents in a tree and decided that they mattered more than my comfort or safety. The real hero is Robert Hayes, and it's time we started treating him that way." The press erupted with questions, but Frank turned and walked away, Tars and Walsh flanking him. That evening, Frank sat in his hotel room watching the news coverage. Every major network was running clips of his statement. Veterans groups were split, some calling him a patriot, others still condemning him as a traitor. But the tide had turned. Public opinion was shifting toward accountability, toward the uncomfortable truth that heroes weren't always heroic and that the uniform didn't grant immunity from justice. His phone rang. It was Bradford. "Frank, I just got a call from the Army Chief of Staff's office. They want to meet with you tomorrow. Officially, it's to discuss your service record. Unofficially, I think they're going to offer you something." "Like what?" "I don't know. But the Army is desperate to control the narrative here. They're getting hammered in the press for covering up Hartman's crimes for so long. They need a way to show they're taking this seriously." The next morning, Frank found himself in another conference room, this time at the Pentagon. The Army Chief of Staff, General Richard Carson, sat across from him, a 4-star general with a weathered face and tired eyes. "Master Sergeant Holloway," Carson began, "the Army owes you an apology. Robert Hayes served honorably and tried to report criminal conduct through appropriate channels. Instead of being protected, he was murdered. That failure reflects badly on this institution, and I want you to know that we take full responsibility." Frank nodded slowly. "Apology noted, sir." Carson pulled out a folder. "The Army is taking several steps to address this situation. First, we're posthumously promoting Staff Sergeant Hayes to Master Sergeant and awarding him the Soldier's Medal for heroism not involving enemy action. Second, we're naming the new Criminal Investigation Building at Fort Liberty in his honor. And third, we're establishing a Whistleblower Protection Review Board to ensure that no soldier ever faces retaliation for reporting misconduct again." He slid a document across the table. "We'd like you to speak at the dedication ceremony for the Hayes Building. We'd like you to help us make sure this never happens again." Frank looked at the document without touching it. "What about Hartman?" Carson's expression hardened. "Colonel Hartman will be stripped of all military honors and decorations. His name will be removed from every plaque, every memorial, every building where it currently appears. And if the Justice Department finds sufficient evidence, he will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." "He's 86 years old," Frank said. "He might not live long enough to stand trial. Then he'll die in disgrace instead of honor," Carson said. "That's something." Frank picked up the document and read through it. The ceremony would take place at Fort Liberty in 6 weeks. Hayes's family would be there. So would the survivors of his unit, who'd finally come forward to tell the truth. "I'll do it," Frank said. "But on one condition. Name it. You make sure every soldier in the Army knows this story. Not the sanitized version, not the version that makes us look good, the real story. The one that shows what happens when good people stay silent and bad people get protected." You make it part of the ethics training, part of the leadership curriculum. You make sure no young soldier ever has to make the choice Robert Hayes made alone. Carson extended his hand. You have my word, Master Sergeant. They shook, and Frank felt something shift inside him. The weight he'd been carrying since finding the documents in the tree hollow was still there. But it felt different now, lighter, not because the burden was gone, but because he was no longer carrying it alone. Part 8. The Long Shadow of Truth, the dedication ceremony for the Robert Hayes criminal investigation. Building took place on a crisp October morning. Frank stood on the platform beside General Carson, looking out at the assembled crowd, soldiers in dress uniforms, veterans in their service caps, and Hayes' family in the front row. Hayes' sister, Margaret, was 81 now, her hair white and her hands trembling as she held the folded flag that would be presented to her in her brother's honor. Beside her sat her children and grandchildren, 3 generations who'd grown up knowing Robert Hayes only as a cautionary tale about the dangers of war. Now they were learning he was a hero. Frank had met Margaret the night before at a private dinner. She'd gripped his hands with surprising strength and said, "Thank you for not letting my brother be forgotten." "He's the one who did the hard part, ma'am," Frank had replied. "I just finished what he started." Now, as the army band played and the flag was raised, Frank thought about all the paths that had led to this moment. Hayes hiding the documents in a tree before his final, fatal confrontation. The tree growing around the secret for 50 years. Frank finding it purely by chance. Walsh publishing the truth. Chun and Parker finding the courage to speak. All of it connected by invisible threads of choice and consequence. General Carson stepped to the microphone. Today, we honor a soldier who exemplified the highest ideals of military service. Staff Sergeant, now Master Sergeant Robert Hayes, did not die in combat. He died because he refused to participate in a cover-up of war crimes. He died because he believed that the uniform demanded integrity, not just obedience. Carson paused, his voice thick with emotion. For 50 years, we failed him. We let his murderers walk free. We let his death be recorded as an accident. We betrayed the trust he placed in this institution. Today, we begin to make that right. He unveiled the building plaque, a bronze memorial with Hayes' photograph and the inscription, "In memory of Master Sergeant Robert Hayes, 1949 to 1972, a soldier who chose truth over silence." Margaret Hayes stood with the help of her granddaughter and saluted the plaque. Around the plaza, hundreds of soldiers snapped to attention and returned to salute, a final gesture of respect for one of their own. Frank spoke last, keeping his remarks brief. "I never met Robert Hayes, but I feel like I knew him through his words, through his courage, and through his refusal to let injustice hide behind authority. He was 23 years old when he died. He had his whole life ahead of him. But he gave that up because he understood something that too many of us forget. That honor isn't about medals or rank. It's about doing the right thing even when it costs you everything." He looked directly at the soldiers in the audience. "Every one of you will face moments in your career when doing the right thing is hard. When reporting misconduct might hurt your unit or damage your career. When staying silent seems safer than speaking up. In those moments, remember Robert Hayes. Remember that he stood alone against corruption and paid the ultimate price. And remember that because one stubborn old man found his story and refused to let it stay buried, Hayes is finally getting the recognition he deserved 50 years ago." Frank stepped back from the microphone. The applause that followed was genuine, sustained, and tinged with something that sounded like shame, the sound of an institution acknowledging its failures. After the ceremony, Margaret Hayes approached Frank. She was crying, but they were tears of relief rather than grief. "I spent my whole life thinking Bobby died for nothing," she said. thinking he threw his life away over something that didn't matter. But it did matter, and you made sure everyone knew it mattered. Frank didn't trust himself to speak, so he just hugged her while Ranger sat patiently at his feet. That evening, Frank drove back to his cabin in Fayetteville. The media had finally left his property, moving on to the next story. The legal battles would continue. Hartman's family was fighting the revocation of his honors, and the Justice Department was still building its case, but the core truth was established now. Part of the public record. Frank sat on his porch with Ranger and watched the sun set over the forest where it had all begun. The oak tree stood silent in the distance, its hollow now empty but its purpose fulfilled. His phone buzzed with a text from Walsh. The Tribune just won the Pulitzer Prize for investigative journalism for the Hayes story. None of this happens without you, Frank. Thank you. Frank smiled and texted back. None of it happens without Hayes. He deserves the credit. But even as he wrote it, Frank knew the truth was more complicated. Hayes had started the fight, but he'd lost it. Frank had picked up the torch 50 years later and carried it across the finish line, and Walsh had given it the platform to reach the world. Justice wasn't a solo endeavor. It was a relay race that sometimes took generations to complete. Frank looked at the photograph of Hayes that he'd framed and hung in his cabin. The young soldiers stared back at him, forever frozen at 23, forever on the edge of a truth that would eventually be told. Rest easy, son, Frank said quietly. Your mission is complete. And for the first time since finding the documents in the tree, Frank felt something that had eluded him through all the threats and investigations and sleepless nights: peace. He'd kept a promise to a dead soldier he'd never met. He'd stood up when standing up was hard. He'd chosen truth over comfort, justice over silence. That was enough. That was everything. As the stars began to appear over the North Carolina pines, Frank closed his eyes and thought about his grandfather's words, the ones he'd carried through 30 years of service. Some debts can only be paid with truth. Frank had paid that debt, and in doing so, he'd given Robert Hayes something that had been denied to him for 50 years, the recognition that his courage, his sacrifice, and his refusal to stay silent had finally been heard. The shadows of the past were long, but they couldn't stand against the light of truth. Not forever. And that was a victory worth any cost. No one gets left behind. Not in the field. Not in memory. Not in justice.